Hello, Frank.
Hello, Professor.
Good afternoon. Another hot day.
Yes.
Um, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the work of William Gibson, a prize-winning science fiction author who is perhaps best known to a lot of people for having said at one point, as long ago as 1993, I think, on the first occasion, that the future is already here. But unfortunately, it's unevenly distributed.
Oh, that was he who said that.
Yeah,
That's resonated well. I've heard that.
and it's he realized that it was clever, and he's said it many times since in
Oh,
slightly different wording. But it's I think it's has a lot of meaning embedded in it, because I think that unevenness is what makes the phase of globalization that we're moving through at the moment particularly challenging, and
hmm
I like to call it the crucial phase. And I think that we're beginning to see more and more of the results of this unevenness. And it seems to be displayed in a number of different ways. I mean, I think that when he first said it, it was somewhat ahead of its time, because at that time none of the really serious conflicts had really started, though they started very soon after that in the Balkans, and
Right.
then of course Central Africa and Sri Lanka was already getting bad, and there were other places after that as well. And all these things have to do with one society resenting another, and often the reason that they resent them is they're at different stages of what I think of as the path to globalization, which is the path to greater awareness of what's going on in the rest of the world. And people, since they don't understand the process of globalization, are always seeing these things in a time dimension which is takes into account only the living memory of the last generation. And so they have all sorts of resentment. And of course, one of the big problems with the living memory of the current generation is that the base of it is the colonial period from 1850 to 1950, where everybody thinks that they've got something to complain about. But I think the unevenness is much more complex than all that. And even though we think that information is much more available now, in fact, there's so much information that we don't know what to do with it, and we can't process it all. And so most of what we do, say, analyze, and so on is based on a small selection of information, because that's all we can handle.
Right.
But other people could go out and find a lot more information which will contradict what we were thinking. However, there's some things in the news today, one of which I think was in the New York Times, about the current administration's uses of information, and the fact that Obama campaigned on the idea of an open presidency, but in fact a lot of what he's been doing has been certainly less than open, if not actually secretive. And I don't think people are aware of this. So on the one hand, there's this enormous amount of information that is difficult to control, but on the other hand, certain government leaders seem to be succeeding in maintaining incredible secrecy about what they're actually doing. And then in The Guardian, and I'm not sure whether this was yesterday or this morning, probably this morning, there was an article about a memoir recently published by a man who was a cabinet minister in Tony Blair's government in a decade ago, I think probably he thought he could publish this memoir with a lot of information in it because he resigned from Tony Blair's government after the invasion of Iraq. And a lot of what he seems to have said in the memoir seems to be a criticism of what Tony Blair was doing before he resigned. But he tells us a lot about nuclear threats, which we didn't know about. And which we still don't know about. And the reason I think this is significant is that for years now I've been struggling to try to understand why everybody at the government level seems to be obsessed with the idea that Iran is building a nuclear bomb, even though Iran says very clearly that it's not building a nuclear bomb and that it would be against Islam and the whole ideology of its revolution to build a bomb. It's a signatory of the non-proliferation treaty.
Right.
And it has certain rights in the non-proliferation treaty. And all the discussions that have been going on in Istanbul and Baghdad and now Moscow are designed to make sure that Iran gives up those rights, even though America is against the regulations of the treaty, working with Israel, that's not a signatory, and India and Pakistan that aren't signatories. And according to the treaty, America is not supposed to work with anybody on nuclear material that isn't a signatory to the treaty. So how do we make sense of this? The reason most people make sense of it by simply saying, well, obviously Iran is a rogue state. So even though it's saying these things and it's signing these documents, we can't believe a word it says, and therefore we've got to stop it. Well, I mean, if really that is what's going on, then what's the point of talking to them anyway?
Right,
Which is
right.
just what Israelis say.
Well, let's, if we could, let's briefly go back a bit to the Guardian article. There were two anecdotes specifically referred to in there. One was the apparent closeness to which India and Pakistan came to a nuclear exchange during Tony Blair's administration. And the article referred to a discussion that the cabinet minister had with two five-star Pakistani generals at a dinner, in which one Pakistani general said, when you go to Delhi, make sure you remind the Indians that we can have a missile ready to be sent over in only 8 seconds. And that was reported to Tony Blair on the plane, and he apparently reacted in horror, as he should. And then the second story was from Bush II, to Blair, saying that he had had a phone conversation with then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, in which Bush gleaned a determination from Sharon that if Iraq stepped out of line, this was in the Saddam era, Sharon was prepared to put a nuclear bomb into Baghdad.
To escalate,
which Bush took to mean going nuclear. So, I mean, both of these things are horrifying to read, of course, and they're going to sell a lot of books. But I think one of the reasons that the book was able to be released, contrary to the parameters of the Official Secrets Act, which in Britain is stronger than it is here, might just be because of the anecdotal nature of the stories. You never know. But to compound those stories with your discussion, I mean, the idea of more nuclear weapons into a already tenuous geographic area, I mean, it could lead to a zero-sum game. I mean, what if, God forbid, the Indians and the Pakistanis started shooting nuclear weapons at each other? I mean, what would happen? What would happen if Israel reacted to some perceived threat and unilaterally launched a nuclear weapon, even though they've said we would not be the first to use a nuclear weapon? I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's the kind of thing where the potential threat is just simply so enormous that treaties are almost irrelevant. It's just a question of Bismarckian kind of power politics, survival of the state, that kind of thing. And the potential that could be negatively caused by an Iranian use of a bomb is just so scary that people react differently.
Well, my reaction to this is as always, not simply as an analyst rather than being worried about whether something is actually going to happen or not, but trying to understand how we got to the situation we're in. And I think that it really is symptomatic of the state of the world at the moment, that there is this tremendous unevenness at every level of what's going on, so that on the one hand you've got an enormous amount of information, on the other hand there's all sorts of things going on that we just don't know about, and it's extraordinarily difficult to understand some of the events because we don't have access to the information on which the actions are being based.
Well,
But also,
if you take that, excuse me, one step further, I mean, if you look at the now admitted American and Israeli role in Stuxnet and Flame, the two computer viruses, which even with what's been released about the capabilities of those two viruses, those two countries have a pretty darn good idea of what's going on inside Iran right now. And the implication is that the fact that this information has been released and discovered and made public is that what has not been released is even more penetrating of Iranian society and Iranian nuclear plans. So it could be a situation where there are people in American and Israeli intelligence who, almost enigma-like, are reading the orders that are being cut at the same time as in World War II, as the Iranian bureaucracy are reading things. You don't know.
yeah, but we also have to remember that it was not planned that we should know that there was such a thing as Stuxnet or
Correct.
Flame.
Right.
And also, some people have pointed out that the fact that this type of cyber warfare has been conducted in Iran means that the Iranians know about it, and they have some very smart
Oh, yes.
cyberpunks as well,
Yes.
and they're probably much more capable now of doing the same thing to other people, and so it's a continuous game. Anyway, it seems to me that this whole situation shows us how unpredictable everything is in the modern world, and I mean, you can look at this in so many different contexts. But the other thing that's so prominent in the news, which is unpredictable from day to day, is the European situation between Germany and Greece, and Italy, and Spain, and people saying, well, who cares about Greece? But however, Italy and Spain, that would really cause havoc. And at the same time, of course, England is doing everything to maintain its position as the global center for finance, and therefore doesn't want to have anything to do with the controls that are being worked out in Europe, but also doesn't want the whole thing to fail, because that would be ruinous for the center in London as well.
Mm-hmm.
But every day the situation changes.
It's every day I drive to work and I listen to Bloomberg News on satellite radio, and every day it's the same story: market hysteria over what's happening in Europe, and it's the same stuff over and over again. But there's never any clarity.
And the latest thing, of course, is that maybe we can't depend on China either.
Right. I mean, they're having their own economic difficulties.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, the European leaders seem to do nothing but meet. They're having another meeting, I believe, this weekend. I mean, didn't they all just meet in Mexico, and then the week before that they met elsewhere, and then the week before that they met elsewhere?
Yeah.
Did they ever do any work on behalf of their own countries in their respective capitals?
I think it's all done on smartphones.
It's crazy.
Well, I think this degree of the point is that the established ways of doing things don't provide the capability that people in positions of responsibility need in order to get things done anymore. And so everything that's being done is somehow beyond the rules, beyond the regulations, which is what makes everything so much more uncertain, unpredictable than it's ever been before, and more interesting.
But doesn't that also tag back to something you've often said, and that is that the existing choices or dilemmas facing global institutions and bureaucracy and global infrastructure outstrip their current capabilities to deal with them.
Yeah.
And that in fact, what's happening is whatever responses are occurring are outside the rules because the rules essentially manacle policymakers.
Yeah. No, I'm afraid that so much of what we say in our weekly sessions uh, reinforces what we've said before, rather than coming up with something actually new. What's new from week to week is the news, which illustrates the ideas we have for how to make sense of globalization.
Mm-hmm.
But what I wanted to do particularly this week was to reinforce the importance of this unevenness, which I think one can't understand if you look at it only from the perspective of the current generation. And it's got to be seen in a much longer time perspective to see how the growth of the increase in the intensity of human interaction and the generation of information
Mm-hmm.
has been developing over a much longer period.
Is that a cumulative increase from generation to generation?
I think so. Yeah, because obviously it's gone faster during some periods, slower at other periods.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, I think that from 100,000 years ago up to the present, you can trace a unilinear increase in the size of arenas of interaction, numbers of people interacting with each other, the growth of cities, and the intensity of the interaction that they engage in, and it's escalated to such an incredible extent over the last 100 years. But if you only see it in the perspective of the last 100 years, then you root it all in the colonial period, and that gives us a wrong perspective, I think.
Good point.
Okay, so see you next.
See you next week. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Spoder. Okay.